My family kicked me out, then tried to steal my house. Now they're homeless and begging for help. Hello, read it. I spent my whole life believing that if I worked hard enough, if I endured long enough, I would finally earn my family's respect. That no matter how many times they pushed me aside, one day they would see me as something more than just an afterthought, more than just a disposable inconvenience. But I was wrong, because some people don't see others as people at all. They see them as tools, as stepping stones, as resources to be drained and discarded. And when you finally stand up for yourself, when you finally say no, they don't just let you go. They turn on you. They try to destroy you. My name is Marcus, and I am 35 years old. If you had asked me years ago what my life would look like, I would have never guessed I'd be here, owning a home, standing on my own 2 feet, living without the constant weight of my family pressing down on me. Because for most of my life, I wasn't allowed to have anything that was truly mine. I was born into a family that never really wanted me. Maybe that sounds dramatic, but it's the truth. My parents, Lisa and Robert, had my older brother, Ethan, first, and to them, he was everything. Their golden child, their pride and joy. He could do no wrong in their eyes, and even when he did, they found a way to twist reality to make it seem like he was still perfect. By the time I came along, I was already an afterthought, an obligation, the extra child they hadn't planned for and didn't quite know what to do with. From as early as I can remember, Ethan was always the favorite. It wasn't just about gifts or attention. It was in everything. If he got in trouble at school, it was just kids being kids. If I did, I was being difficult. If he wanted something, our parents found a way to get it for him. If I wanted something, I was told I needed to work for it, that life wouldn't hand me things the way it did for other people. They called it teaching me responsibility, but I knew better. They weren't teaching me anything. They were just making sure I understood my place. I tried to be the good son. I tried to make them proud. I got good grades. I stayed out of trouble. I did everything I could to be useful, hoping that one day they would see me the way they saw Ethan. But nothing I did was ever enough. If I brought home an A, they barely acknowledged it. If Ethan so much as showed up to class, he was showered with praise. If I needed help with something, I was brushed off. If Ethan needed help, the entire household revolved around making sure he got what he needed. It wasn't just favoritism. It was something deeper, something uglier. I wasn't their son, not in the way Ethan was. I was more like a tenant in my own home, someone they tolerated because they had to. And Ethan knew it. He wielded that knowledge like a weapon, lording his place in the family over me every chance he got. He would take my things without asking, break them, and laugh when I got upset, knowing our parents wouldn't punish him. He made sure I knew that no matter what happened, he would always come first. I spent my childhood trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided I wasn't worth much. And when I turned 18, they made sure I understood just how little I meant to them. They kicked me out. No warning. No discussion. Just a simple, cold statement. You're an adult now. Time to take care of yourself. And that was it. I was out. It wasn't about money. My parents were comfortable, financially stable. It wasn't about space. The house was big enough for all of us. And even after I was gone, Ethan stayed. He lived there well into his 20s, rent-free, with every need taken care of. No, this wasn't about necessity. This was about getting rid of something they had never wanted in the first place. I left with nothing. No savings, no safety net, no support. Just a few bags of clothes and the crushing realization that I was truly on my own. And while Ethan continued to live comfortably, I spent years struggling just to survive. I crashed on friends' couches, took whatever jobs I could find, worked long hours for barely enough to cover rent in whatever rundown place I could afford. I went hungry some nights. I had days where I wasn't sure if I was going to make it, where I questioned if maybe they were right about me, if maybe I really was worthless. But I kept pushing forward because I had no other choice. And eventually I made it. I worked my way up, slowly but surely. I saved every penny, learned how to survive without a safety net. It took years, but I finally built a life for myself. And then, after more struggle than I care to remember, I did something they never expected. I bought a house. Not a mansion, not some luxury estate. Just a modest, comfortable home. But it was mine. No one could take it from me. No one could tell me I didn't belong here. For the first time in my life, I had something that was entirely, unquestionably mine. And for a little while, I thought that meant I was free. But people like my family don't just let go. Not when they think you have something they can take. It started small. My parents, who had spent years pretending I didn't exist, suddenly started reaching out. Calls, texts, awkward attempts at small talk. At first, I thought maybe, just maybe, they had changed. Maybe they regretted what they had done. Maybe they actually wanted to reconnect. But I should have known better. Then came Ethan. He showed up unannounced one day, standing on my porch like he had every right to be there. He walked through my house like he was inspecting it, making comments about how nice it was, how lucky I was to have a place of my own. And I saw it in his eyes, the same look he had when we were kids, when he would see something I had and decide it should be his. And then the truth came out. My mother called me one evening, her voice unervingly casual. And without hesitation, she told me that they had decided that my house would be better suited for Ethan. Not asked, not suggested, told. Ethan had finally decided he wanted to settle down. He needed a place to live, and my parents saw no reason why he should go through the trouble of buying his own home when mine was right there, waiting to be handed over. And when I refused, when I made it crystal clear that this house was mine, that they had kicked me out years ago and had no right to demand anything from me now, they declared war. They had spent my whole life treating me like nothing. But now suddenly I mattered, not because they valued me, but because I had something they wanted. And if I wouldn't give it to them willingly, they would do everything in their power to take it from me. First, it was guilt. The long speeches about family, about how Ethan deserved stability, about how I was being selfish. Then came the anger. How dare I act like I was better than them? How dare I refuse after everything they had done for me? And then the real threat. They told me they had legal options, that they would fight me for my own home, that they had the resources to make my life miserable, that I wasn't strong enough to go against them. They had underestimated me. I had survived without them once. I would do it again, but this time, I wouldn't just survive. I would fight, and I would win. I should have expected the fight to get ugly. My family had never been the type to accept boundaries, not when they thought they could bulldoze through them. But even after everything they had done, I wasn't prepared for just how far they would go. For days after my mother's call, I waited for them to back down. I thought that maybe, after my refusal, they would get the message and move on. But I should have known better. They had spent my entire life treating me like I didn't matter, until now. Now, I wasn't just their forgotten son. I was an obstacle standing between them and what they wanted, and they had never liked obstacles. The calls started coming more frequently. My mother, my father, even Ethan, taking turns trying different angles. My mother went for guilt, telling me how Ethan was struggling, how I was being selfish by not helping my own brother. My father went for intimidation, reminding me that they had ways of handling things. Ethan, of course, played the victim, acting as if I had personally wronged him by refusing to hand over my home to him. I ignored them all, but then things escalated. One day, I came home from work to find my front yard filled with my family. My parents, Ethan, even some extended relatives I hadn't seen in years. They stood in a tight cluster near my driveway, acting like they had every right to be there, like this was some kind of intervention. The moment I stepped out of my car, my mother was the first to speak. Her voice was calm, practiced, the same tone she had always used when trying to manipulate me into doing what she wanted. She told me they had been talking as a family and had come to the decision that it was time for me to do the right thing. Ethan needed this house more than I did. It was time for me to move on, to let go of the past and be part of the family again. I didn't say anything. I just stared at them, letting their words hang in the air, watching as they waited for me to cave. Because that's what they expected. It was what they had always expected. I had spent my whole life giving in, bending to their will, allowing myself to be pushed aside for Ethan's sake. But not anymore. I told them to leave. My mother's face hardened instantly, her mask slipping. My father's jaw tightened, his hands clenched at his sides. Ethan scoffed, shaking his head like I was the one being unreasonable. Then, My father dropped the real bombshell. They had already spoken to a lawyer. I felt my stomach tighten, but I didn't react. I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing my panic. Instead, I simply asked them what they thought they could possibly fight me on. The house was in my name. I had bought it fair and square. There was no loophole, no technicality they could exploit. That was when my mother's expression shifted, her lips curling into a smile that sent a chill down my spine. She told me they had found something. A way in. I had used their address when I first applied for my mortgage. It was a simple thing, something I had done without thinking at the time. When I had started the process of buying my house, I had still been moving between apartments, and my parents' address had been the most stable one I had access to. It had meant nothing to me, but to them, it was an opening. They claimed that because I had used their address for official documents, it showed that I had relied on them financially, that the house wasn't truly mine, that it had been a family effort, a shared asset. I knew it was ridiculous. Anyone with a brain would know it was a weak argument, that it wouldn't hold up in court. But that wasn't the point. They weren't trying to win. They were trying to drain me. Legal battles cost money, and they knew it. They knew that even if they had no real case, dragging me into court would bleed me dry. They had the resources. They had the connections. And they were betting on the fact that I didn't have the means to fight them for long. I told them to get off my property. They didn't move. Not until I pulled out my phone and started recording. The moment the camera was on them, their expressions changed. My mother's voice softened into something sickly sweet. My father took a step back. Ethan rolled his eyes. But I didn't stop. I made sure to capture every word, every veiled threat, every manipulative tactic they were trying to use. And then I called the police. They left before the officers arrived, but the damage had already been done. I knew now, without a doubt, that this wasn't over. They were going to come for me, and I had to be ready. The unexpected twist. For the next few days, things were quiet. Too quiet. No calls, no visits, nothing. I should have felt relieved, but instead, my nerves were on edge. My family didn't give up this easily. Then I got a call from my bank. Someone had attempted to access my mortgage information. The request had been denied, of course, because it wasn't their house. But the fact that they had even tried made my blood run cold. They weren't just fighting me in court. They were trying to get inside my finances. I spent hours locking everything down, changing passwords, setting up fraud alerts, making sure that every piece of my financial life was untouchable. But the fact that they had tried, it made something inside me snap. They had spent years taking from me, pushing me aside, making me feel like I wasn't good enough. And now, when I had finally built something for myself, they were trying to rip it away. They wanted a war? They were about to get one. I hired a lawyer. If they wanted to fight, I was going to be ready. And this time, I wasn't going to be the one who lost. My family had underestimated me. They thought I was still the same person they had tossed aside years ago, the one with no power, no voice, no fight left in him. But I wasn't that person anymore. I had spent years surviving without them, learning how to stand on my own, how to build a life they never wanted me to have. And now, when I finally had something that was mine, they thought they could take it from me. They were wrong. After I found out they had tried to access my mortgage information, I knew I had to move fast. I spent the next few days locking everything down. I froze my credit, updated my bank accounts, and made sure that no one could get into anything that belonged to me. I called my mortgage lender directly and informed them that no one but me was authorized to make any inquiries or requests regarding my home. Every possible loophole, every possible weakness, I sealed shut. And then I hired a lawyer. I didn't wait for them to make the first legal move. I went on the offensive. When I met with my attorney, I laid everything out, the sudden push for my house, the harassment, the attempted legal threats, and the latest fraudulent attempt to access my mortgage. He listened carefully, taking notes, his face unreadable. Then he leaned back and told me something that made my stomach turn. My family wasn't just trying to take my house. They were trying to force me into financial ruin. By dragging me into court, they weren't expecting to win outright. What they were expecting was that I wouldn't be able to keep up with legal fees, that I would become so buried in financial stress that I'd have no choice but to give in. If they drained me of my resources, if they made my life miserable enough, they figured I would eventually give up the house just to make them stop. I clenched my jaw, my hands curling into fists. I had spent too long clawing my way out of nothing to let them drag me back down. So I told my lawyer to do whatever it took to shut them down. Days passed. I expected some sort of retaliation, another visit, another attempt to intimidate me. But nothing happened. No calls. No texts. Just silence. It put me on edge. My family didn't give up this easily. If they weren't trying to talk me down, it meant they were trying something else. Then I found out what it was. A letter from their lawyer arrived in the mail. My hands shook slightly as I opened it, scanning through the legal jargon, feeling my blood boil with every line. They were filing a petition to claim interest in my property. Their argument? That my house belonged to them. They claimed that since I had used their address during my mortgage process and had relied on their support to buy my home, they had a financial stake in the property. They alleged that because I had lived in their household while making financial arrangements, it was a family investment, not solely mine. It was insane, a complete fabrication. I had never received a cent from them. I had never relied on them for anything. They had kicked me out when I was 18 and never looked back. But now, suddenly, they were trying to rewrite history, trying to make it seem like they had been the ones to support me all along. I felt sick. I called my lawyer immediately. He laughed when I read him the letter. Not because it was funny, but because it was so desperate, so weak, so blatantly fabricated that it was almost pathetic. Their claim had no legal standing. They had no proof, no documentation, nothing that tied them to my home. It was all lies, an attempt to scare me, to bully me into thinking they had a case. But they didn't. And now, they had just given me the perfect opportunity to fight back. My lawyer told me we were going to countersue for harassment, fraud, and attempted financial manipulation. I wanted to hit them where it hurt. I wanted them to feel the consequences of their greed, of their entitlement, of their complete disregard for me as a human being. So I told my lawyer to go after everything. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to bury them. The moment my parents and Ethan realized I wasn't backing down, they started panicking. I knew because suddenly, they weren't so bold anymore. The calls came again, but this time, their tone had changed. No more demands. No more threats. Now it was all about misunderstandings. My mother left voicemail after voicemail, saying they never meant to escalate things this far, that this was all a family disagreement that had gotten out of hand. My father, who had once threatened to use their resources to destroy me, suddenly wanted to talk things through like adults. Ethan, ever the coward, texted me to say he didn't even want the house that badly, and that this was all our parents doing. I didn't respond to any of them, because I knew the truth. They had expected me to crumble. They had expected me to fold under pressure. They had counted on me being the same quiet, powerless kid they had abandoned years ago. But I wasn't. And now, they were the ones who were afraid. A week before our court date, my lawyer called me with news I wasn't expecting. He had dug into their finances. And what he found? My parents were broke. They had nothing. Years of reckless spending, bad investments, and poor financial decisions had finally caught up with them. They weren't just trying to take my house out of greed. They were trying to take it because they were drowning. And Ethan? He wasn't just a spoiled golden boy. He was their only way out. They had been supporting him for years, paying for his lifestyle, covering for him every time he failed. And now, they had nothing left to give him. That's why they had come for me. Not because Ethan needed my house, but because my parents needed to save him. And they had been willing to destroy me to do it. I felt something shift inside me. A cold, final realization. This had never been about family. It had always been about control. And now, they had lost it. By the time we went to court, they were already defeated. Their lawyer barely put up a fight because there was no fight to put up. They had nothing to support their claims, nothing to justify their actions. The judge dismissed their petition immediately. And when my countersuit was brought up, they settled. They didn't want to, but they had no choice. They were already drowning, and the last thing they needed was a legal battle that would push them even further into financial ruin. They tried to save face. My mother still left one last voicemail, telling me she hoped I was happy with what I had done, that I had turned my back on my own family. I deleted it without listening to the rest. I hadn't turned my back on my family. They had never been my family to begin with. And now I was finally free. Winning should have felt like victory. I should have felt a sense of triumph, a rush of satisfaction knowing that after years of being cast aside, used, and underestimated, I had finally beaten them at their own game. But when the dust settled and the court ruling was finalized, I felt nothing. No joy, no anger, just an eerie kind of emptiness. Maybe it was because I had spent too long fighting, too long bracing for impact, too long waiting for the next attack. Maybe it was because, deep down, I had always known that this wasn't going to be the end of it. My parents and Ethan had lost, but people like them didn't just disappear. They didn't just accept consequences and move on. They found ways to shift the blame, to twist reality, to make themselves the victims in a story where they had always been the villains. And I knew it was only a matter of time before they tried to rewrite what had happened. For the first few days after the court ruling, there was silence. No calls, no texts, no unannounced visits. The house felt unnaturally quiet, and I should have been relieved. But instead, I was on edge. My parents didn't give up this easily. They had spent my entire life making sure I knew my place, discarded, forgotten, second to Ethan in every way. Now that I had fought back, now that I had won, they weren't just going to let that go. Then, the rumors started. At first, it was small things, whispers from extended family members I barely spoke to, vague comments on social media from distant relatives I hadn't seen in years. My parents had started spreading their own version of the story, twisting the facts to make it seem like I had stolen from them, like I had turned my back on them when they were at their lowest. They painted Ethan as the struggling brother, abandoned and betrayed, while I was the selfish one who had refused to share my success. I ignored it at first. I had spent too many years caring about what they thought, about what people who had never lifted a finger for me had to say. But then, people started reaching out. Some messaged me with fake concern, asking if I had really kicked my own family to the curb. Others weren't so subtle, outright calling me an ungrateful son, a cold-hearted brother. One relative even had the audacity to tell me that family comes first, no matter what. It made my blood boil. Where were these people when I was homeless at 18? Where was this family loyalty when my parents kicked me out with nothing, when Ethan got to live comfortably while I struggled just to survive? Where was this outrage when they tried to steal my home? They didn't care about the truth. They cared about the illusion of family, the lie that we were all supposed to play along with. And now that I had refused to play my part, I was the villain. But my parents weren't done yet. One night, I came home late from work, exhausted, just wanting to collapse in a bed. As I pulled into my driveway, my stomach dropped. The porch light illuminated a familiar figure sitting on the steps. Ethan. I parked and sat in my car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, willing myself to stay calm. I didn't want to deal with this. I had nothing to say to him. But I also knew that if I ignored him, he wouldn't just leave. He had never known how to take no for an answer. I stepped out and approached slowly, keeping my expression unreadable. Ethan looked different. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by something else. Something I had never seen in him before. He looked lost, hollow. There were dark circles under his eyes. His clothes were wrinkled. His hands fidgeted slightly, like he was trying to find the right words. For a long time, he didn't speak. He just stared at the ground, avoiding my gaze. Then, finally, he let out a long breath and admitted that he had nowhere else to go. I wasn't surprised. After the court ruling, our parents had taken a financial hit they couldn't afford. They had relied on Ethan for nothing, but Ethan had relied on them for everything. He had never worked a real job, never paid his own bills, never learned how to be independent. And now that they couldn't support him anymore, he had no safety net. He had burned through whatever money he had left, and the people who had once kissed the ground he walked on had stopped answering his calls. He was, for the first time in his life, completely alone, and he had come to me. The irony was almost laughable. The brother who had spent years making my life hell, who had taken everything he wanted without consequence, who had expected me to give up my home just so he could continue living in comfort. He was now begging me for help. And for the first time in our lives, I had all the power. He didn't outright ask to move in, but the implication was there. He danced around it, throwing out phrases like, "just until I get back on my feet," and "I wouldn't be a burden," as if we both didn't know that he had never once done anything without expecting someone else to clean up after him. I let him talk. I let him squirm, and then I told him no. Ethan's head snapped up, his eyes widening like he hadn't even considered the possibility that I would refuse. He stammered, trying to throw out reasons why it made sense, why it was the right thing to do. But I just stood there, arms crossed, unmoved. I reminded him of everything, how he had never once been there for me, how he had mocked me when I was struggling, how he had tried to take my home because he thought he was entitled to it. I told him I didn't owe him anything, and then I told him to leave. He stared at me, disbelief turning into something uglier, resentment, maybe even hatred. For so long, he had been the golden child, the one who got everything while I was left with nothing. And now, I was the one with a home, with stability, with freedom, and he had nothing. He muttered something under his breath before walking away, shoulders stiff with anger. I watched him disappear down the street, knowing that this wasn't the end of it. Ethan wasn't the type to accept defeat. He was just like our parents. He would find a way to spin this, to make himself the victim, to turn the story into something that made me the bad guy. And I didn't care. For the first time in my life, I wasn't scared of what my family thought of me. I wasn't desperate for their approval, for their acceptance, for their love, because I finally understood the truth. They had never loved me. They had only loved what they could take from me. And now, I had nothing left to give them. I locked the door behind me, exhaled, and let the weight of years of resentment slip off my shoulders. I had spent my whole life being told I was nothing, but I had built something out of nothing, and I wasn't going to let them take it from me. Not now. Not ever. Ethan didn't come back the next day or the day after that. The silence was strange, unsettling in a way, like a storm had passed but left the air charged with something unresolved. I knew better than to think this was over. People like my family didn't let go. They didn't admit defeat. They found new ways to claw their way back in, to twist reality, to make themselves the victims. Then, out of nowhere, I got a message. Not from Ethan, not from my parents, from an unknown number. At first, I thought it was just another relative trying to guilt me, another person who had heard my parents' version of the story and decided I was the villain. But when I opened the message, my entire body went cold. It was a real estate listing. My house. For sale. For a moment, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. It was my home, with pictures of my front yard, my living room, even my bedroom. My stomach twisted, a sickening mix of rage and disbelief. Someone had put my house up for sale. Without me. I called my lawyer immediately, my voice sharp, barely controlled as I explained what I was looking at. He was silent for a few seconds before he let out a low breath and told me to stay calm. He promised me that there was no legal way for anyone to sell my house without my consent, but the fact that this listing even existed meant one thing. They were trying something. While he started digging, I called the real estate company listed on the page. A woman answered, cheerful and professional, asking how she could help. I told her that I was the owner of the property she had listed for sale, and I demanded to know who had contacted her. There was a pause, then a hesitant apology. Apparently, my parents had reached out, claiming that they were acting on behalf of their incapacitated son. I almost laughed. Incapacitated. That was their angle? They were trying to claim that I wasn't mentally fit to handle my own affairs, that I was incapable of managing the home I had bought with my own blood, sweat, and sacrifice. They had really gone that far. I told the agent in no uncertain terms that my parents had no legal authority over me, that they had been cut out of my life, and that if the listing wasn't removed immediately, they would be hearing from my lawyer. She apologized again, assured me that they would take it down, but the damage was done. My parents had tried to sell my house out from under me, and now they had crossed a line they couldn't come back from. I had spent years tolerating them, allowing them to treat me like an afterthought, cleaning up the mess they left behind. Even when they had kicked me out, even when they had tried to take my home, there had been a small part of me that had still been holding on to the idea that maybe, just maybe, one day they would change. That one day, they would regret how they had treated me, that they would want to make things right. But this was the final nail in the coffin. I wasn't just cutting them out, I was erasing them. The next day, I met with my lawyer in person. We went over everything, every fraudulent attempt they had made, every document they had tried to forge, every manipulation they had pulled. And then I made my final decision. I wasn't just going to press charges for harassment. I was going to file a restraining order against my parents, against Ethan, against anyone who had tried to meddle in my life, who had tried to rip away what I had built. I wanted legal, permanent protection from them. I wanted there to be no way for them to ever touch my life again. And I wanted them to know it was final. I had the papers served at my parents' house. Ethan was still living there, and I knew that when they opened that envelope, when they read the words in black and white, it would finally hit them. They had lost. For good. The calls came almost immediately. My mother sobbing, my father furious, Ethan alternating between pathetic apologies and outright threats. I didn't answer any of them. I just sat in my living room, in the house they had tried so desperately to steal from me, and listened to the silence. And for the first time in my life, it was truly mine. But the real twist? 2 weeks later, I got another call. Not from my family, from my lawyer. Apparently, my parents' financial situation had taken an even worse hit than they had let on. Their house, the house they had kept Ethan in, the house they had chosen over me all those years ago, was in foreclosure. They had nowhere to go. And Ethan? He had come crawling back to them, only to find that they had nothing left to give him. It was poetic, in a way. They had thrown me out into the world with nothing, believing that I would fail, believing that I would always be beneath them. But in the end, they were the ones who had lost everything. They were the ones without a home. And I was finally free. I never looked back.